to moral relativism is that there are certain basic precepts recognized as being morally right by at least some people cross virtually all boundaries of moral community. The wrongness of torture is not a fact, but recognition of it has a bench head wherever someone is being tortured, unless the person genuinely consents to being tortured. In other words, there are community transcending moral language games that are also, in this sense, universal ones. The claim here is not that any given precept can be shown to have been present in all society at all times, nor that all widely accepted precepts are just. It is simply that the cultural relativity of moral language does not itself serve as a plausible defense of an outrage in a world where we all speak to each other about morals, still as we where we all claim to have signed up to some common moral rules. If moral discourse cuts across cultural boundaries, the argument against universalizing moral theory from the standpoint of multiple language games loses much of its force. Determinism. A final argument against normative theory comes from determinism. There are bodies of theory which appear, at least on a certain reading, to deny that human beings exercise the powers of agency that are a precondition of moral choosing. There is no sense in judging a course of action to be morally blameworthy if those who carried it out had no real choice but to do so. Someone who is forced at gunpoint to kill another is generally not considered to be as culpable as someone who carefully plans and premeditates as murder. Are there senses in which all of us are deprived of morally relevant choices, or in which our choices are at any rate more limited than normative theory supposes? Several types of determinism can be distinguished. Some might regard the individual agent as determined, or at least very strongly constrained and pressured by external forces beyond his or her control. Individuals might be subject to hidden structures or to unfolding historical processes driven by internal and impersonal logic. Forces or relationships associated with economic life are commonly attributed a more or less determining role in currents of both Marxism and liberalism. Other determinists might stress national traditions or ecological constraints, and still others supernatural forces. A second kind of determinism might hold that we are determined by forces inside ourselves beyond our control, such as our subconscious and or our genetic inheritance. It might even be said that there is no consciousness outside of brain processes, and so therefore no moral command center, not itself reducible to the firing of distinctive coalitions of pre-wired neurons. So, in what sense are we free to make moral choices? Is there indeed a we to do the choosing? There are many components to the determinist case, and not all can be addressed here. I shall consider just two of the questions it raises. The first is whether the advocate of the determinist position is himself or herself amoral. A Marxist of determinist bent may still consider capitalism to be unjust and socialism just. A Freudian convinced of the power of the subconscious may still consider it is desirable that a patient be shown the way to greater mental health. In these senses, they may still make normative judgments. They may indeed have begun their research in order to solve a moral or normative problem, such as the existence of capitalism or neurosis. Moreover, value positions often lurk behind or seek justification in ostensibly value free claims about ineluctable causal connections between phenomena, such as, to cite one example, human nature and greed. Of course, the presence of value assumptions in a scholarly enterprise does not show that its conclusions are false, but we should be alert to those values nonetheless, since they give us a deeper understanding of the strengths, weakness, and larger significance of an intellectual project. The second question is whether moral reasoning as an intellectual activity is judged to have a role in determining historical personal outcomes. This is really important question for the prospects of normative theory. There may be forces that constrain us, but do they leave us with important choices? In the making of the choices, can we be influenced by arguments about the rightness or wrongness of course of action? Alternatively, can those who shape the behavioral sanctions and incentives that regulate us to be influenced? If the answers to these questions are yes, then normative theory has a role. Two things can be said here for normative theory, both of a tentative kind. The first is that it would be very difficult to demonstrate that we are confounding the aims of a communitarian pluralism. The pure celebration of moral and cultural differences will not help if another community's language game allows that our own territory be seized or that one of your citizens be sentenced to death by the moral. Two things can be said here for normative theory. Both of a tentative kind. The first is that it would be very difficult to demonstrate that we all are never left with important and morally salient forms of choosing. Even the previously mentioned person at gunpoint has some choice between killing and being killed. And there are many situations in life where the range of choice available to us is much larger than in that scenario. Many writings in supposedly determinist currents would readily concede a place to human agency within variously understood context of structural constraints. If we do exercise meaningful choice, it seems at least plausible that moral language can influence the choices we make. Moral discourse is a communicated is a part of our cultural environment, a part of the way cultures are communicated and reproduced. Of course, we encounter the moral language in many forms, and that part of it presented to us in theoretically explicit ways is just one of them. Nonetheless, rigorous moral talk may count for something, especially among certain kinds of opinion forming elites, such as educators, legal theorists, and political thinkers. It will be more influential in legalistic cultures or cultures which esteem scholarship, where participants in moral conversation are self doubting, uncertain about an issue, or on a particular matter are disinterested. Moral theory may help clarify their views, give expression to their inarticulate feelings, or persuade them to modify views inconsistent with other things they believe. This section has defended normative theory against the claims of positivism, relativism, and determinism. The case for normative theory offers a medium for giving logically rigorous and factually informed consideration to human moral options in those areas where human beings have moral options, that is to say, whether they exercise something we can recognize as free moral agency. Areas of moral choice may sometimes be considerable, and within their boundaries, moral theory can make a difference. There is, of course, no guarantee that the difference it makes will be for the better, or that its approaches generated by normative theory will be good ones. They will, in case, be many. Engagement with normative theory nevertheless proceeds from the hope that moral actors who debate their options in an open and self conscious way will, on the whole, do fewer of the things most of us would consider bad, than those who proceed unreflectively or suppress moral debate. Normative theory applied justice and liberty. One important area of implication of normative theory is justice or the distribution of goods. Here normative theorists have reached into the heart of and arguably have influenced one of the most persistent and hard fought controversies in the post 1930s Western political life. How far should the state intervene to structure or pattern the distribution of goods in society? It is the debate which has raised against the background of the growth, the economic and legitimation crisis of the welfare state. One camp in this debate may be called very roughly social democratic, the camp which argues or implies that there are moral grounds for the state to engage in forms of social provision or redistribution of goods. Since such actions involve coercive transfers of resources from some citizens to others, how might they be justified in society that claim to respect individual autonomy and liberty? Several answers are possible. Defense of the welfare state might be made on the utilitarian ground that it ensures the greatest happiness for the greatest number, for example, because those who have few goods gain a greater utility from obtaining at least some, or because welfare economics raises general welfare by boosting aggregate demand. The deontological objection to such arguments is that they subordinate individual rights to a single concept of welfare. At the same time, they leave welfare itself on an insecure footing. So, what strategies are open to social democratic deontological liberals? The strategy made famous by John Rawls is that of the original position. As I noted earlier, Rawls asks us to imagine the founders of the state who have no advanced knowledge of their talents or prospects or social ranking in the new order. From behind this veil of ignorance, they must select the principles of justice that will govern the redistribution of primary social goods such as well being and liberty. Rawls believes they will choose two principles: a first principle of equal liberty, which enjoys special priority, and a second principle which permits only those inequalities in the distribution of goods that benefit the least advantaged. Though inviolable, the principle chosen allow for a plurality of ends in the distribution of all but primary goods. Moreover, they are, in theory, compatible with a wide variety of socio-economic systems, from capitalism to democratic socialism. A second deontological strategy finds warrant for intervention in the market in the foundational principle that is categorical and needs no justification. This is the approach of Ronald Dworkin, for whom the basic principle is question is equal concern and respect for the human beings. Dworkin asks if what it means for a government to treat its citizens equally. He notes, using American nomenclature here, that conservatives and liberals will come up with different answers. He then sets out to explicate the liberal answer. He believes such a government will take equally seriously the different ends and preferences of its citizens. It cannot do this by distributing goods centrally according to uniform criteria, and so must allow the workings of the market. However, it is not only preferences that are differentiated, so are people's talents, level of inherited wealth, and special needs. In a free market, these will translate into inequalities of outcome which liberals cannot defend. The liberal will therefore seek to reform the market and will probably turn to a mixed economic regime, either redistributive capitalism or limited socialism. A third possible justification of state provision would follow from a theory of basic and universal human needs. The problem here, of course, is that there is little agreement about what constitute the primary goods of human beings. I have already alluded to Alan Givert's answer. Whatever the diversity of ends that humans might choose, certain basic requirements must be met. The generic requirements of voluntary and purposive action before they can even begin to act as moral agents. These requirements include both freedom and well being. To these, there is a universal right. The right to well being cannot, however, be satisfied limitlessly without contravening the right to freedom. As with Dworkin, Giverts comes out in favor of a meliorative, supportive status rather than either the free market or full substantiative egalitarianism. A fourth approach is communitarian. Michael Walzer, in his Spheres of Justice, argues that proper distributive criteria vary not only between cultures and communities but also between different spheres of justice, such as security and welfare, money and commodities, office, hard work, free time, education, love, and divine grace. He argues for a complex equality designed to ensure that the distributive criteria salient to one sphere do not impinge on other spheres where different criteria are appropriate. In a market society, this may mean giving special attention to preventing those who legitimately have a certain amount of money from using it to, say, buy people or office or honor or exemption from military service. Commodities money should not be permitted to buy. In the sphere of security and welfare, there must be a more or less extensive system of communal provision in recognition of need and membership of a community. But since definitions of need and basic goods vary, there can be no universal individual right to any particular set of goods beyond the right to life and basic subsistence. Beyond these, the appropriate policies of redistribution will flow from shared community understanding and shifting political determination. All these positions allow that redistributions can be morally legitimate. It is this conclusion which libertarians regard as an infringement of basic liberties and as supplying ultimately a license to totalitarianism. Libertarians may be of left or right, but it is those of the right, the free marketeers, that have mounted the more influential challenge to social democratic or welfarist ideas. Free market libertarians range in turn from outright anarchists who refuse any kind of state authority to those who justify a minimal state. Here I shall be concerned with libertarian objections to one specific aspect of the state's role, its intervention to provide social goods and redistribute wealth. Why do libertarians consider such interventions a threat to basic rights and freedom? It is helpful here to introduce a basic distinction famously discussed by Isaiah Berlin between negative freedom, defined in terms of the absence of coercive constraints on action, and positive freedom, defined as the power to achieve desired ends or to achieve self mastery. Berlin believes that only the former is properly counted as freedom. Policies to enable individuals to achieve their ends may be justifiable even where they involve coercion of others. This would be so in the case of helping the poor via taxation, but they should not be considered as increasing freedom. Free market libertarians concur in a definition of liberty purely in negative terms. They are extremely reluctant to see any part of this liberty traded off for some other social good. Coercive state social intervention, by definition, abridges individual negative liberty. Such abridgment is, according to libertarians, both morally unjustifiable and deleterious to social welfare. This is the argument of, for example, F.A. von Hayek. Hayek believes that only possible basis of social freedom and economic issues is the self-directing individual. Individuals should have equal access to negative liberty secured through the rule of impersonal laws and regulations that allow them to pursue their own ends within the law. State redistribution of income or wealth violates not only liberty but also equality. It requires that the state determines rule of distribution which discriminate against some individuals and in favor of others. These rules cannot be devised on uncontroversial criteria and are inevitably arbitrary in their effects. Nor can state redistribution be justified as a subversive to social injustice. To argue that a given distribution of goods is unjust is to imply that it constitutes a deliberately intended outcome for which redress might be sought. Injustice can only result from the malign intentions of particular individuals. In a free market society, distributions are the result of the unintended consequences of countless voluntary transactions. There is thus no party from which redress might legitimately be exacted. Hayek also argues that state economic social intervention produces failure. He dislikes the assumption that the complex human societies can be planned rationally, arguing that this fails to register the limits of human knowledge. Spontaneously evolved the institutions resulting from the unintended effect of voluntary transactions among large members of people are, he argues, more likely to be successful than institutions deliberately designed to be a supposedly omniscient center. For Hayek, free market policies are thus not only more just but are also less harmful to social welfare, including that of the poor. Robert Nozick developed his own distinctive libertarian position. He disagrees with anarchist argument against a state, favoring instead a minimal state that restricts itself to maintaining law and order. He rejects all other kind of intervention on the grounds that they violate individual autonomy as conceived by Kant. Instead of treating individuals as ends in themselves, they use some individuals without their consent for some supposedly higher purpose, such as the achievement of a particular distribution of goods. Nozick develops a particular theory of property ownership that he terms historical. He argues that if a person's holdings came to him or her by a just process of acquisition or transfer, no government could justly transfer a part of those holdings to another without consent. The pursuit of a patterned distribution of goods at a particular time violates the historically inherited entitlement to property. This, of course, raises the question of how just entitlements to holdings are required in the first place. Here, Nozick uses a Lockean argument. We acquire entitlements by mixing our own labor, which we own, with unowned resources. Provided this primary acquisition does not worsen the situation of others at the time, it is just. All inequalities resulting from the subsequent use and free change of holdings is just so long as the initial appropriation of resources is just. This, of course, raises the question of how just. There is no space here to debate the merits of these various libertarian and social democratic arguments. A brief concluding comment can, however, be made. None of the above arguments is uncontested. Each raises a host of problems. In my view, those posed by the libertarian arguments are more acute. It can be argued that Hayek overstates the extent to which given distribution of goods constitute an unforeseen outcome. It may be that inegalitarian outcomes are the predictable results of a certain kind of exchange system, and that the participants in its exchanges are aware of these external consequences of their private transactions. Arguably, logic cannot demonstrate why labor mixing should carry the moral weight that it does, nor why all voluntary exchanges of justly acquired property are just, even where, say, those exchanges are structurally unequal. The argument that free market bring the greater benefits to the poor carries moral weight but of a utilitarian kind and still awaits historical just verification. Arguments about the right to goods may be problematic in their own ways, but I think the social democratic camp shows that there are strong moral arguments for redistribution. Those who accept a Dworkin premise that human beings deserve to be treated with equal concern and respect cannot treat as morally neutral the inegalitarian results of economic system that are products of history and convention rather than of natural and purely spontaneous human activity. And writers such as Gibbet do demonstrate something inconvertible, that to be freely choosing agent, we must have both liberty and well being. More than that can be said to be active participants in politics and thus collectively self determining, we may need access to politically relevant resources on a roughly equal basis. Substantive equally may be a precondition of equal political agency. Evaluating normative theory. The big issues facing the normative theory can be summarized in many ways. I shall content myself with identifying what I consider to be its two central questions. One is whether normative theory is possible at all. I have laid out a few of the arguments against positivist, relativist, determinist, and suggested that none finally establishes its case. Contrary to the claims of the critics, I argued normative theory can offer a rigorous and informed way of addressing options open to human beings in those spheres of life in which they can exercise free moral agency. The second major question is internal to normative theory. Which decisions about human goods should be left to individuals privately or political communities collectively to determine according to their preferences, and which should be either constrained or guided by fundamental principles? It is unhelpful to divide participants in normative political debates into relativists on the one hand and those claiming to have identified the objective moral principles on the other. The utilitarian, deontologist, and communitarian all seek their fixed points, and all would leave certain important matters to individual, democratic, or community decision. The classic utilitarian find their point of fixity in the assumptions of a rational utility maximizing individual in the scientific hope that it might be possible empirically to measure and compare preferences, and in the principle of utility itself. On the question of the actual content of utility, they are, however, relativist of a sort. The Benthamites, at least, are relativist also insofar that they would not constrain the individual's free choice of ends by unassailable natural right claims. The, the deontologists find their fixed point in a variety of starting points: God, human nature, or social contracts, and in the principle of fundamental transhistorical claims of rights and justice. On the other hand, there are content to leave the choice of ends to individuals themselves, viewing principle of right and justice in part as the necessary groundwork for this free choosing. Finally, communitarians tie moral obligation to community, eschewing the individualistic relativism of the other two camps At the same time, they allow for an inter-community relativism, denying the universal moral vantage point of the unencumbered self. In my own view, these three camps all offer important arguments. Benthamite utilitarianism itself seems largely to be spurious. However, the idea that the moral worth of human conduct can be established without any reference to the benefits and harms it brings seems perverse, and it is doubtful that even a hardened deontologist would wish to claim that it can be. The morally relevant harms and benefits in question may be those that follow from observing certain rules rather than individual actions. They may accrue to individuals over some longer terms, or in way they are difficult to specify in narrowly practical terms. Deontologists who argue for the recognition of rights for something prior to rights, such as equal concern and respect for human beings, must have in mind that the thought that violating these rights and precepts will bring harm if observing them brought nothing but centuries of historically proven misery. Even deontologists would think twice about advocating them. Nevertheless, deontological tradition itself generates argument which no utilitarian, consequentialist, or proportionalist can ignore comfortably. It is all very well to talk of harms and benefits, but can these simply be weighed up so that wherever aggregate totals of benefit outweigh harms, a course of action can be considered proper? Again, it is intuitively sensible to take account of consequences, but what kind of consequence count as acceptable? If a policy brings benefit to many but intolerable harm to a few, it is therefore to be judged as being morally acceptable. Here, only a hardened utilitarian could say that it can be. Deontology stipulates criteria which any just outcome must satisfy. It appeals to the conviction that individuals cannot be treated unfairly or as means to end or be deprived of liberty and well being. The weighing of harms and benefits of public policies will not, even where each agent's preference count for one, automatically respect this conviction. Paradoxically, deontology might disclose where ruder calculations of cost and benefit become acceptable, where fundamental rights are not at stake, and perhaps or where they conflict. Because it often makes foundationalist assumptions about human nature or need, deontology will also be more open to the possibility that some rights exist which are not disclosed by our immediate subjective preferences, and that their protection is a precondition to pursuing our individually or democratically chosen ends. The main problem with communitarianism is that it is reluctant to accept that individual rights might be appealed to against community morality, or to recognize that community morality meet each other in a globalized moral village. Though endorsing a pluralism of moral communities, it lacks a principle of individual rights in which to anchor a normative commitment to pluralism within all moral communities. Of the three traditions, however, communitarianism is the only one to remind us that important areas of decision making are not of the public kind to which abstract rules can easily be applied, and that in public itself, collective democratic decision making and participation themselves properly decide a lot of what we are entitled or obliged to do. The classic text of Anglo American discussion since the early 1970s have been Rawls, Nozick, both for deontological liberalism, Walzer in the case of communitarianism. Here, 1982 offers a notable statement of kind of utilitarianism, as does John Hersani in his Morality and the Theory of Rational Behavior, reprinted in Sen and Williams, useful and mostly critical. For some noteworthy examples of more recent approaches in normative political theory, see Rorty 1989, which presents a pragmatic perspective, Bauman 1993, which offers a postmodern account, Pateman 1989 for a feminist critique of normative political theory, Rawls 1993, which presents a modification of his early universalist position, and Etzioni 1993, a well timed restatement of an increasingly fashionable
Political
communitarianism.
Science, Chapter 3, Behavioral Analysis, David Sanders. The behavioral approach to social and political analysis concentrate on a single deceptively simple question. Why do people behave in a way they do? What differentiates behavioralists from other social scientists is their insistence that observable behavior, whether it is at the level of the individual or the social aggregate, should be the focus of analysis, and b. that any explanation of that behavioral should be sustainable to empirical testing. Scholars working in the behavioral tradition have investigated a wide range of substantive problems. Behavioralists have extensively analyzed the region that underlie the main form of mass political participation in democratic countries, voting, for example, health, etc. 1994. They have also examined the original of participation in other more unconventional form of political activity such as demonstration, strikes and even riots. Example, Barnes and Cass 1979. At the elite level, behavioralists have analyzed leadership behavior, placing particular emphasis on the connection between the way in which leaders view the world, their attitude and values, and the particular action that they take. For example, Allison 1977, King 1985, Sanders 1990, Dunleavy 1993. In terms of social aggregates, behavioral analysis has examined the action of interest group. For example, Grant and Marsh 1979, Wilson 1990, and political parties. For example, Budge and Fairley 1983, Budge and Label 1992. At the international level, behavioral analysis has also focused on the action of nation states, for example, Rosnow 1969, as well as on the behavior of non-state actors such as multinational corporation, international terrorist group and supranational organization such as the EU, for example, Keohane 1984, Baldwin 1993. In all these diverse contents, the central question that behavioralists seek to answer are simple. What do the actor involved actually do? How can we best explain why they do it? These are obviously not the only question that can be asked about individual and social actors. Behavioralists simply believe that they are the most important ones. This chapter is divided into 4 sections. The first provides a brief outline of our original of behavioralism and summarize the core analysis exertion that underpin it. The second section review the main criticism that will carry varying degree of justification have been leveled at the behavioral approach. The third part describes one major study, Gurr analysis of political violence, which illustrate some of the more positive features of behavioral analysis. And the final section consider the influence the behavioralists continue to exert on contemporary political researchers. The rise of the behavioral movement and its core characteristics. The behavioral movement, which assumed an important position in the social science in the 1950s and 1960s, had its philosophical origin in the writing of Auguste Comte 1974. In the 19th century and in the logical positivism of the Vienna Circle in the 1920s. Positivism, which has popular in Britain by Alfred Ayer and in Germany by Karl Hampel, exerted that analytic statement made about the physical or social world fell into one of three categories. First, such a statement could be useful. They could be purely definition statement that assign a specific meaning to a particular phenomenon or concept. For example, we might define families living on less than one third of the average weekly wage as living below the poverty line. Second statement could be empirical. That is to say, they could be tested against observation in order to see if they were true or false. Third, statement that fell into neither of the first two categories, they devoid of analytical meaning. For the positivist, in short, meaningful analysis could proceed only on the basis of usual tautologies and empirical statement. Metaphysics, theology, aesthetic, and even ethics merely introduce meaningless obfuscation into the process of inquiry. It would not be correct, of course, to assume that behavioralism accepts all the philosophical precepts of positivism. Even as behavioralism was gaining increasingly wide acceptance among social scientists in Alice was gaining increasingly the 1950s. Positivism itself was being subjected to ferocious philosophical criticism, not least on the ground that it was unclear whether positivist assertion that there were only three types of statement was itself tautological, empirical, or meaningless. This said, behavioralism view of the nature of empirical theory and of explanation were strongly influenced by the positive tradition. Although there are many definitions of these two criticism terms, most behavioralism would probably accept something along the line of the following. A. An empirical theory is a set of interconnected abstract statements consisting of assumption, definition, and empirically testable hypothesis which purports to describe the explain the occurrence of a given phenomena or set of phenomena. B. An explanation is a casual account of a occurrence or something phenomena or set of phenomena. An explanation of a particular class of events consists in the specification of a minimum non-tautological set of antecedent necessary and sufficient conditions required for its occurrence. The importance of these definitions of theory and explanation lie in the implications that they have for theory evaluation. For positivists, the crucial question that should always be asked about any purportedly explanatory theory is how would we know if this theory were incorrect? Behavioralism endorsement of a central importance of this question is precisely that demonstrate its intellectual depth to positivism. For both positivistic and behavioralistic, there are three main ways in which explanatory theory can be evaluated. First, a good theory must be internally consistent. It must not make statements such that both the present and the absence of a given set of antecedent conditions are deemed to cause the occurrence of the phenomenon that is purportedly being explained. Second, a good theory related to a specific class of phenomenon should as far as possible be consistent with other theories that seek to explain related phenomena. Third, and crucially, genuinely, explanatory theories must be capable of generating empirical prediction that can be tested against observation. The only meaningful way of deciding between comparing theory which might appear to be equal plausible is other respect is by empirical testing. This testing can be conducted either at the